So this article here, let's see, glamour, travel, sexism, when flight attendants fought back. In 1958, when Mary Pat Laffey Inman became a stewardess, as they were then called, for Northwest Airlines, she was 20 years old, and the clock was already ticking. At 32, she would be forced to retire. That is, if she didn't marry, get pregnant, or even gain too much weight before that. All were grounds for termination. It was the golden age of aviation for everyone except, perhaps, the woman serving in flight meals to the nattily dressed passengers. 6 years later, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act outlawing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and female flight attendants began to join forces against sexism. In 1970, Ms. Laffey Inman, a union leader and Northwest's first female purser, the lead attendant on a flight, spearheaded a class action suit, Laffey versus Northwest Airlines Incorporated, that resulted in the airline paying more than $30 million in damages and back wages in 1985. It also set the precedent for nondiscriminatory hiring of flight attendants across the industry. But even then, not everything changed. Flight attendants on some airlines were still subjected to wait-ins. Into the 1990s, Northwest merged with Delta Airlines in 2008. I personally know someone, she had applied for American Airlines. She went down to Texas. I think it's Dallas-Fort Worth. That's where they're based. And the only reason she didn't get the job, she waited a little bit too much. Yeah. And this was, let me see. I think this was going back into the 2000s or something. Yeah. When that happened to her. So, let's see here. So, now, decades later after the Live decision, Ms. Laffey Inman, 86, one of several former flight attendants, featured in Fly With Me, an American experience documentary that chronicles how women fought to overcome discrimination in the airline industry. It premieres on PBS on February 20th, which is today. The New York Times spoke to Ms. Laffey Inman about how she made history. This interview has been edited for length and clarity, and they asked, what inspired your career in the airline industry? I was working at Montefiore Hospital in Pittsburgh. I always wanted to travel ever since I was a kid. As a flight attendant, I could travel, all expenses paid. I thought it was wonderful. Other stewardesses and I laughed about how lucky we were to be in the industry at that time. We would bid for 3-day layovers in Paris, London, Amsterdam, Tokyo. A limo would be there to pick you up and take you to the hotel. What was involved in training at the time? Flight attendants had a 6-week session where we learned about the airline and had emergency and safety training. We learned the commands to use in case of emergency. And we had grooming classes. Women came and taught us how to put on our makeup and polish our fingernails. Aside from keeping up appearances, how was sexism evident in the industry? When I started, senior stewardesses talked about younger men being hired to be in charge of the aircraft and the crew, bypassing stewardesses who have been flying for quite a while. They discussed this in whispering tones, or sometimes not whisperings. It was always a bone of contention. Men were elected to positions that controlled the union, and they did the negotiating. Stewardess could not really look at the job as a career because we had to quit when we got married or when we were 32. That was always in the back of our mind. How did you become the first female purser? In 1968, Northwest hired 4 men off the street to be pursers. I called the director of labor relations and said, "You must post this bid." When they did, many women were intimidated, but I applied and got the job. How were flight attendants' duties different in the 1960s? We had to work with military air contracts. In times of emergency, the U.S. military has a right to commandeer aircraft to be used on a military basis. We flew to Vietnam quite often during the Tet Offensive in 1968. I was a purser and I was new and didn't have any seniority, so I was assigned to those flights. We bring 165 soldiers to Okinawa, then shuttle them to Vietnam and bring 165 back, hopefully. We got in and out of Vietnam as quickly as possible because there were missiles going back and forth. So let me just pause here. She mentioned the Tet Offensive, and right now you have the Tet holiday. The Tet holiday is celebrated in Vietnam, the lunar holiday. So during the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive in 1968 was when they decided, right, the offensive, the Viet Congs decided, well, they're going to give it all they can, and they made a surprise attack on the American bases. I think it was in Hue. Hue was where the citadel is, the ancient capital of Vietnam. And they came in aggressively. And it was a very powerful moment that could have changed the course of history during the war, but it failed. So that's what she's talking about, the Tet Offensive in 1968. Taking on a giant corporation is not easy feat, especially as young women in the 1960s. We didn't have a leg to stand on legally until the Civil Rights Act, which included discrimination based on gender. So see, the Civil Rights Act didn't only benefit black people, it benefited women too. A lot of times people don't look at it that way. But yeah, she benefited from the Civil Rights Act, and she's a white woman. What role did you play? In 1967, I became the head of the union at Northwest and negotiated the first non-discriminatory contract with the airline. We could prove women flight attendants had equal skills and responsibilities. That's when we brought back the stewardesses who were fired because they were over 32, or because they were overweight, or because they were married. How did you end up with a class action lawsuit? In 1969, negotiations for the next contract commenced. The negotiating committee was dominated by men. I had expected changes, but Northwest refused to include language that would treat women pursers the same way as male pursers. I talked to a labor lawyer who said we had a case. Ultimately, 70% of the unions signed on. The airline dragged it out for 15 years, took it to the Supreme Court twice, but the case was remanded back to the Federal District Court of Appeals, where Rudy Bader Ginsburg was the judge who had written the opinion in our favor. So this was Justice Ruth Ginsburg, who was in the High Court for a while. At the time you filed a lawsuit, did you have any idea of the impact you would have on the industry and on history? No. I was just looking for equality in pay. I wasn't thinking 40 or 50 years ahead. I was simply hoping every step on the judicial ladder would go our way. As far as flying today, with the many reports of passengers behaving badly in flights and the stress that causes the crew, what do you think can be done to make flying better? I'd like someone to pass a law to widen the seats. That's one of the reasons there's so much tension. So this article is from the New York Times.